Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all of our guests for joining us this evening. I wanted to start with each of you. Lenore, why don't you start? I want each of you to describe how you came to this issue.
For me, the free-range kids issue? Well, as you just heard, I let my 9-year-old ride the subway alone. Actually, it wasn't just me. It was me and my husband, who's out there somewhere, America's worst dad. Thank God I actually don't see him. But anyways, the reason we had let him do this was because he felt he was ready for it, and we know our city, we know our kid, and it seemed like if he was ready, we were ready. And I didn't write the column about it immediately because it wasn't a publicity stunt, although had I known. But when I did write it, the blowback was so immediate, I really hadn't realized how scared my generation of parents had become to let their kids do anything on their own, even though we all grew up loving our freedom as kids. And the disconnect between the way we were raising our own kids and the way we appreciated being raised just struck me as bizarre, and I've just been, sort of exploring my way through it since.
You say you were unaware of how afraid your generation had become as parents, but you must have been at least partially aware if you thought it was worthy of an artitle to write about how your kid was riding the subway, right?
That's why he has 5 bestsellers. Got one. Just right for a minute. Here's what happened. We let him ride the subway, and then I didn't write about it immediately because it didn't strike me as that big a deal, but I was talking to some of the other 4th grade parents, and they were like, "You did what?" And I was like, "Yeah, we let him ride the subway," and they were going to wait till their kids were older, like 38 or 39, and when I heard that, I wanted to write it, but I have to confess that when I looked back at old columns of mine, I used to be at the Daily News, not anymore. Anyway, I found columns of mine from when they were like 4 and 6, and I said, yeah, I let them go to the bathroom at the New Victory Theater without me traipsing their boys, without me going in. Is that terrible? And I let them play downstairs in our courtyard when they were, 7 and 9. Is that so terrible? And so I realized that had been a theme, which was I just didn't understand why we were so afraid of strangers. I'm a reporter by trade. All I do is talk to strangers. So that really got my gall. And as a reporter, I knew that the crime rate today is lower than when we were growing up. So between not letting our kids do anything and having the reason be because times have changed, it just didn't make sense to me. And I just hate hysteria. I know I sound slightly hysterical, but I hate hysteria. And that's really what wakes me up every day and I gotta fight this fight.
Yeah. John and Greg, how did you come to what was behind the original, this foray into the book Coddling America?
Well, first thing I want to say as a disclaimer is that I'm recovering from a concussion from a car accident. So if I say anything stupid, that's the concussion. But if I say anything really good, that's all me. So I was the weird person who went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law. I took every class that my law school offered. I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty when I ran out of classes to take on the First Amendment. I interned at the ACLU of Northern California. This was my lifelong passion. And I started working for a new organization. I became the first legal director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. And even back in 2001, it was easier to get in trouble for what you said on a college campus than most people thought. But at the time, who you'd get in trouble with was overwhelmingly administrators. And there was this kind of conservative stereotype about students being the ones reporting their professors and demanding speech codes, and that was just not true. Another kind of curveball in the story is, and it's a little bit of a dark turn, is around 2007, I had a very bad bout of depression, like a scary, hopefully the worst I'll ever have, and I ended up being hospitalized for it. And the thing that really helped me deal with, and I had issues with depression my whole life, but the thing that really made these battles winnable, pretty much from this point on, was cognitive behavioral therapy. So I was working on campus defending freedom of speech while trying to train myself to not catastrophize, a cognitive distortion that can make you anxious and depressed, to not personalize, to not engage in black and white thinking, to not overgeneralize. All these things are cognitive distortions that depressed and anxious people do a lot. And amazingly, if you get in the habit of talking back to those kind of exaggerated voices, it's very effective at dealing with anxiety and depression. And I was watching on campus administrators, in my opinion, exercising modes of behavior that seem to be saying to students, you're in great danger all the time. And at the time I was like, well, but thank goodness students aren't taking these lessons to heart. And unfortunately, that seemingly changed overnight. 2013, 2014, at the time we had no clue exactly why. Students who used to be the best constituency for free speech on campus suddenly became, to some degree, sort of like the stereotypes people have of the don't you dare say that kind of attitude very, very quickly. And what was strange about it was that they were sort of medicalizing the reasons for it. They were saying, not, I don't want this guy on my campus because I hate him and he's a bigot. I don't want this guy speaking on my campus because it will be psychologically harmful to people I know, usually not to me, but to other people. Other unnamed people will be harmed by their presence. And this sounded exactly like what I was frightened was going to happen in terms of sort of bad pseudo-medicalization, pseudo-psychological thinking. Mm-hmm. So I'd recently become friends with John, and we went to get lunch at a Indian place down in the village, and we chatted about the idea, and to my delight, he wanted to write an article about it.
So, John, were there specific incidents in your own experience that led you to think that there was a broader trend going on?
Yeah. So I've been teaching since 1987 when I started graduate school, and at Penn, and then at Chicago, and then for 16 or 17 years at the University of Virginia. And I thought the job of a teacher, or at least how to be a good teacher, is you provoke a variety of emotions during class, you get people to look at things from different perspectives, you lead them through a path which sometimes is uncomfortable, and then you resolve it. And so there can be like a dramatic structure to a class. And so that's the way I always taught, and I always trusted my students and felt that they trusted me. And then I moved to NYU in 2011, and it's not so much moving from UVA to NYU, it's that suddenly, for the first time, in the spring of 2014, I mean, it really was overnight. It was like from out of nowhere.
It was really strange.
In the spring of 2014, I had several incidents where students reported me to the dean and demanded that he do something about things I'd said in class, like teaching the Milgram experiment. One student thought that I was saying that the Nazis were okay. It was just this level of,
you shouldn't have said that. They weren't okay.
So there was just the sense that students would give you the benefit of the doubt because you're all in this together, you're trying to put on a great class together, that seemed to vanish after a couple of such complaints. And I was really puzzled. And one student was talking about issues in terms of I don't feel safe. And I was like, what? What do you mean? I couldn't understand it. And this was all in the spring of 2014. And so when Greg invited me to lunch in May of 2014, it's sort of like, like you're seeing, people turn into zombies here and there, and suddenly a guy comes along and says, in the lab, I just found this new kind of parasite. And so he told me his idea. I said, oh my God, this is brilliant. And I sort of suggested, oh, you should write that up, and I should write it up with you. That was the Origin of the Atlantic article.
A question for all of you. The one thing that all of you have in common is that you live on the East Coast of the United States in relatively privileged areas.
Queens.
John, well,
Southeast DC.
John, you just mentioned Penn, Chicago, Virginia, NYU. I don't see the University of Southern Kentucky on that list.
Right.
How certain are you that the phenomenon you're describing is national, or do you think it is specific to privileged quarters of pampered American life?
Let me take that for starters, because as we've been talking about the book around the country, I always ask a few different questions, and when I meet with administrators, I ask various questions. And one thing that I found is wherever you go, anywhere in America, if you're dealing with kids born after 1995, everybody from the college president through the professors, through the guitar teacher, through the counseling center, everybody is saying, what hit us? The anxiety, the depression, there's a tsunami of it. And the soccer coach says, I mean, like all of a sudden, if you criticize a kid, she won't come back to, she quits the team. And so the fragility, the anxiety, the depression, that is totally national. The politicization of it, the idea that people are vulnerable, not me necessarily, but her and him and them, they're vulnerable, and therefore I'm going to call you out and destroy you because you said something that et cetera. It's that call-out culture, that is not national. That is, if you look at the top liberal arts colleges in the Northeast and the West Coast and Chicago, you find it. In fact, that's where all the shout-downs have been. We have a map at Heterodox Academy. We created a map where every shout-down, where a speaker was literally shouted down so they couldn't speak, and it's all right along the eastern seaboard and the rim of the Pacific coast and Chicago.
Yeah. So what's special about, Lenore, why don't you start with?
Wait, I had a Kentucky story. I couldn't believe it. You mentioned a state that I know something about. So can I just tell you where I think this is coming from?
We're always open to Kentucky stories.
This is,
Why?
that's the 92nd Street Wise motto, where Kentucky stories live.
Highly specific.
Right. That's why I come here. So this lady wrote to me about a month ago. She's in Kentucky, and every afternoon when her son, who's 9, gets dropped off by the school bus, the rule that the school has is that there has to be an adult waiting at the bus stop to walk him home. It's actually, you can see her house from the bus stop. And she has her father normally walk him home. One day the dad was in the bathroom, and one day the kid wasn't supposed to come home, and so the grandfather wasn't waiting to walk him home. But if it becomes a third time, she gets reported to Child Protective Services because she is neglecting this child, and the child has to go back to the bus depot, which seems like the least safe place you could possibly take a kid in Kentucky. But so you're wondering, how do kids get so fragile? They're being told, they're being forced to be supervised every single second, even in Kentucky. And then the rationale for that is that otherwise they're not safe. And it's like, they are safe, but if you're always being told that you're not safe when you are safe, nothing seems safe. And I think that's why we hear the word, I don't feel safe on campus, because that's just become the watchword for everything.
And if I could just add one thing on the class issue, and I take the class issue extremely seriously. And in the book, we recommend several books, including Putnam's Our Kids, which I think is just absolutely fabulous. I do feel like in my work at FIRE, we still see at schools that tend to be more sort of working class, more commuter schools, we still see cases exactly like the kind of cases I was seeing in 2005, where students are being told that they can't protest outside of a tiny little free speech zone. A lot of these sort of like administrators throwing their weight around, don't you dare criticize the university case. But when it comes to these highly ideological cases, we do see them at more elite colleges.
A couple questions. John, you mentioned something happened around students born in 1995. Mm-hmm. Well, let's dig into this.
Okay.
What happened in 1995?
Take it away.
And Lenore, you can chime in on this shift that you have identified in attitudes of parents. Mm-hmm. Can you also locate the point at which this?
I can't locate it perfectly, but I can tell you that it is this generation and possibly a little bit of the generation right before it. 1984, we started putting the pictures of the missing kids on milk cartons, and we neglected to say, by the way, this was a runaway, or this kid was taken in a custodial dispute,
yep.
right, in a divorce battle. And I think if you're growing up with, here's your Rice Krispies, and here's the person who's been missing, it's really, and there's a parade of them, it's like, who's it, it's like, it's like a series. And so that, I think, became, we really became obsessed with the idea of predators and no child ever being safe. And that's when the crime really was ramping up.
Yeah.
From, 70s, 80s, 90s. It peaks in 93, but the fear keeps going even though the crime went down. So I can't say exactly when, but I do feel like this idea that any child that is not supervised is going to be snatched off their bike starts with the milk cartons.
But I think that's more the background, that's the pre-story. Mm-hmm. So Greg and I structured the book around this mystery of why is it so sudden? Why did it come out of nowhere with kids born in 1995? Mm-hmm. And so we think there's 6 different intersecting threads that really all come together, and that is one of them. That is the background of increasing paranoia, and Lenore's always talking about this. Somehow in the 90s or early 2000s, we got the idea that if you take your eye off your kid just to reach for a carton of milk, they're going to be snatched.
Milk again!
That's right. But we think that there's 2 major factors here that combined. So one is the vast overprotection. The central idea in the book is that human beings are anti-fragile. That is, kids might look fragile, but actually the evolutionary design is for us to go out, fall down a few times, then we learn how to stand up. We reach for something, it drops, we learn how, we're built to learn by trial and error, where kids seek out risk. Once they master something, they try to make it more dangerous. That's what they need to do. And beginning maybe in the 90s, we started saying, risk? How about zero? How about no risk? Is that good for you? And so we basically deprived them of the ability to develop their normal abilities as an autonomous human being. So that really ramps up in the 90s. And so we begin to get a more fragile generation. We begin to get kids who are not as robust. And then social media, I think, is the reason why the cutoff is so sharp. Yeah. Because Facebook opens up, it used to just be for college students when it came out. And then in 2006, now it opens up to anybody who lies and says they're 13. But, but 11-year-olds aren't really getting on Facebook in 2006. And then the iPhone comes out in 2007, but it's expensive, and so 11-year-olds don't really have iPhones in 2007. But by 2011, they mostly do. Most teenagers now have an iPhone and social media, and they're checking it hundreds of times a day. There's a wonderful book called iGen by Jean Twenge. This is what really clued us into the sharpness of it. Yep. You look at the behavior changes that happened. The late millennials are still getting driver's licenses. They still sometimes drink with their friends. And they still sometimes go out on dates and go to work at jobs. But beginning with kids born in 1995, all that plummets because all they're doing is sitting home alone on their devices. And if you do that, it seems if you do that, if you get social media in college, it doesn't seem to be bad for your brain. But if you get it at age 11, 12, or 13, now your brain is just beginning to develop, and your parents let you have your device at night, so you're sitting there and somebody just commented on something you said, and you're trying to go to sleep, but you're worried about it. And so if you imagine 11 to 13-year-olds bathed in stress hormones and not sleeping year after year, suddenly when they show up in college in September of 2013, it's like from out of nowhere.
Yeah, it did line up extraordinarily well when we were looking into it. And I think of social media, John and I think of social media as something that really sped up two different factors. Certainly, the depression and anxiety, if you look at the data, when people use a lot of it, they tend to be more depressed. It doesn't explain enough of the variance, but
it's a small effect that we can prove, but it is there.
Right, it is there. But when people are a little skeptical of this, the way I try to, and it disproportionately hits girls, and the way I try to explain it is, imagine the absolute worst of junior high school, 24 hours a day, forever. and then they immediately get it. But the other thing that it sped up, that both John and I are very interested in, and we do actually see as a causal factor, had been the much slower process of group polarization, particularly political polarization. And really, social media pats you on the back for having an echo chamber, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. Essentially, gives you a nice dopamine rush the thicker your echo chamber is. So I actually think social media speeds up both the depression and anxiety and the group polarization. So a lot of trends. One trend that was actually working was relatively quick, sped up like crazy as soon as we had social media available.
Yeah. So here's my question. I really only have one question.
Mm-hmm.
This is
okay, better be a good
Must be a big one.
There was the greatest generation. Mm-hmm. Right? People who grew up during the Depression, fought in the war. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they graciously and modestly accepted the term greatest generation tells you something about how great they were. But so the greatest generation looked at the generation that followed, the baby boomers, and said they were narcissists.
Yep.
And blamed television. Mm-hmm. And there was the famous phrase, the me decade, right? And there was an established narrative of generational complaint. Mm-hmm. That here they are, we sacrificed, and these people are all about themselves. Mm-hmm. The baby boomers then turned around and looked at Generation X. What did they say? Remember? They said they were aimless. Mm-hmm. There was that whole notion. Why were they aimless? Because of video games and heavy metal music, and possibly gangster rap.
D&D.
And there was, I am old enough to remember, books written on the many flaws of Generation X and how we were going to be. What did Generation X do? Well, they turned around. Are you Generation X, Joe?
I'm last of the baby boom.
Oh, you're last. Are you Generation X?
X, yep.
Yeah. All right, well, direct
Doesn't ask me.
So, Greg, you then turned around.
Yep.
And you looked at the generation that came below you and you said, they're soft.
Yep.
Right? Everyone's got a problem with the generation below them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why can't I just say, oh, this is more of what's been going on forever?
I can start this one because I have fun with this one.
I'm quite sure, in fact, that if we went back to the 18th
Actually,
and
Socrates.
17th century,
Socrates has it
Socrates
all.
yeah.
complained
Yeah,
about kids these days.
George Washington looked at those whippersnappers at,
Yep.
and just said, they don't want to cross the whatever river it was.
Delaware.
But, we
They want their moms to cross
well,
the floor.
when the original article came out, the Atlantic had someone who wrote a letter that was basically like, it's just the two old guys complaining about the younger generation, and they had a picture of Abraham Simpson from The Simpsons that was old man shouts at cloud. But I had fun answering it for two reasons. One, just saying that people always say this, it's not really an argument. It's just saying that like this is a truism. And but also one thing that I like to point out is, my grandfather was born in 1889 in Russia. His grandfather was a serf. And while I do say, like, listen, I actually think there was some validity. As a Generation Xer, when they were saying that we were aimless, I kind of think we were aimless. I think that when the silent generation picks on the baby boomers, there's endless things to pick on the baby boomers about, and they were right. So intergenerational critiques aren't necessarily automatically wrong. In fact, sometimes there's some truth to them. But given the tremendous amount of comfort and progress we've had just over the last 2 centuries, it is the case that you can say pretty reliably that everyone's grandmother had it a lot harder than they do. So what is the solution? It's not that we say, oh, it needs to be hard like it was in the good old days. The best possible thing that we could imagine having is a world in which we enjoy the fruits and comforts and video games and media of the current age, but are able to also draw from the tremendous wisdom that was brought by much harder times from people like Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or the Buddha.
And I'd like to add to that by saying there's a psychological principle that losses loom larger than gains. And so each generation is different from the one before, and the older one looks at them and says, well, they don't have this thing that we have, therefore they're deficient, and we don't notice the thing that they do have that is good. Mm-hmm. That's the normal process. That is eternal. That's not what we're talking about. That's part of it. That's fine. But above and beyond that, if you look at objective measures of functioning, such as the number who cut themselves to the point where they have to be hospitalized, that's not just like, we think that's bad, but for them, I mean, it's a good thing,
Absolutely.
So, so this is what is so stunning, is by objective measures, kids born after 1995 are cratering in their mental health. Now, the stats, if you look at self-reported depression and anxiety, they go way up beginning with that birth year. Colleges are overwhelmed by people coming in saying they're depressed and anxious, not schizophrenia, not bipolar, not anything else, just depression and anxiety, not even stress. They're not more stressed, they just don't know how to deal with it. But here's the kicker. Many people say to us, oh, that's just self-report. Like, these young people, they're so comfortable talking about depression. It's not a real thing. And if you look at the graphs of hospital admissions for cutting yourself, the graph for boys actually is fairly low, and that actually does not go up. The boys don't change. But the girls, the millennial girls just sort of go like this. The older iGen girls, or the graph of late teens girls goes like this. And the graph of 11 to 13-year-olds from around 2000, we get to 2013, it goes like this. It's tripled. 3 times as many girls are putting themselves in the hospital, preteens. Same thing for suicide. The rate's way up, and these exact trends are exactly the same in the UK and in Canada. So that's why we think it's a combination of overprotection, which is happening in all those countries, plus the specific spur of social media, which specifically affects girls a lot more than boys.
Yeah, how severe the increase in anxiety and depression. I always talk about like the 2 things that really surprised me in working on the book. The first one was how bad all of the data was on the increase in anxiety and depression, and that's whether it's self-reports, it's whether what we're hearing actually from people on the ground, and that's what we're seeing from things that you can't effectively fake. That scared me to death. It was much worse than I ever thought. The surprising thing that really struck me about the book, particularly as someone who has a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, was how well established it is that kids need free time, free play, unstructured time. And I felt like I talked to a number of experts who were practically yelling this, basically saying this is really well established.
Kids need free time!
Yeah, exactly. And meanwhile, with my kids, when I look at other people in Washington D.C. my age, like they're scheduling them from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. like this is not to 11 p.m. like this is not a thing.
Got to enrich them. Right?
What, let me ask the question another way. What's good about the current generation? So if we go back to the the generational paradigms that I was describing earlier, we can say that the greatest generation were selfless and thrifty, but they were also emotionally stunted and, you name it, cheap, I mean, whatever. We can say that the baby boomers were narcissists, but we can also say on the flip side, they were, open to, much more open to human difference, much more tolerant of diversity, in each case. So is there something that is there a flip side to all the things you're describing that's actually beautiful and positive about what this generation is doing?
Yeah, well, the data in iGen shows what we kind of all know, which is that to them, differences in sexuality are just not a big deal. When we were growing up, it was like, are you pro-gay marriage, anti-gay marriage? But it was like a thing, and to them it's like, who cares? Right. So the march of tolerance, which has been going on for decades and decades, is certainly marching on. So they're incredibly tolerant. They're much less likely to drink, do drugs, have premarital sex, all sorts of things that get teenagers in trouble. The flip side of that, of course, is teenagers probably need to get in a little bit of trouble to test the limits. And so, we can point to specific bad things that they're not doing, but I think it is ultimately a stunting of ability, which means that it's not just like, well, it's this and that. I think it really is, as Twenge puts it, by all the markers of development, an 18-year-old today is at the level of a 15-year-old from 30 years ago. And this is why Greg and I recommend in our book, we should consider not having 18-year-olds on college campuses. They're really not ready for it, a lot of them. And so the norm should be a gap year. And this might be the only way to get kids away from the overprotective helicopter parents. Right. So,
You think that's going to get them away, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be tracked. What I was going to say about this generation is that all is not lost. I mean, we do, in their book and in our book, Let Grow has a couple of ideas that are really practical and really simple to give kids back the independence that will lead to more resilience. One of them is just, it's called the Let Grow Project. It's not even a project. It's the teachers telling the kids to go home and do one thing on their own without their parents. It's homework. And when kids do it, it breaks the cycle pretty fast because the parents are so proud that the kid has done, oh my God, my kid got a Slurpee, yay, high five. But that changes the parent as much as the kid because finally they've been forced to let the kids go and do something in the real world, and the reinforcement of the pride that the parents feel allows them to do it again. And with people like us saying free time is good and kids need some independence, between that and having a push from the school, and everybody in the school is doing it, so you're not the crazy mom, that's really, that can just reset the whole thing. I know that sounds pretty easy and self-serving, but it can really change things fast.
Can I just, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to add was, it put FIRE in a little bit, my group that defends free speech on campus, in a little bit of an odd position, because for years we'd been sort of lamenting sort of the apathy. Back when students were very good on free speech, they also could be a little apathetic, but they would, join the petition saying, save Professor Blah, sometimes a lot more than Professor Blah's colleagues. But we were put in somewhat of a strange position where there was suddenly, some real activism on campus, and some of it was great. And some of it was, however, activism that was requesting that people be fired for what they said, or for using free speech to argue for new speech codes. So we had to say, it's kind of like, we're glad you've overcome the lack of apathy. We're not totally psyched about the fact that some of it seems to be directed at freedom of speech. I think there is, a desire to improve and change the world, when you actually see, it's hard to tell what the best aspects of a generation is going to be until they start getting out into the workplace and starting really making their mark.
But wait, so I'm getting more confused, not less.
That's our goal.
So the current generation is more tolerant, more open to people of different sexual orientations, less likely to use drugs and drink heavily. I'm assuming that we could make some comments about that they might be more empathetic. Mm-hmm. Certainly, they're what you're describing are people whose antenna for other people's pain and feelings so. Why can't we just say that we have traded one set of trade-offs? We have exchanged one set of trade-offs for another.
Yeah, I'd like to take that. Sure. So, first of all, most kids in this generation are actually doing fine. Most are not suffering from depression and anxiety. Most come to college, they want to learn. The problem is that with this new morality, a subset have been empowered to call others out. This is the heart of the reason why we all should be alarmed, very alarmed. So think about it like this. Suppose you married someone who, no matter what you said, he or she just always took it in the worst possible way. They were always looking to prove that you're bad, you're wrong, and that was just constant. That would be really hard to be married to such a person. And now imagine that you admit students to your school and 5% of them are like this. And you're a professor and you always trusted your students, but no matter what you say, 5% of them are looking for some way to report you to the dean. It changes your teaching. You don't trust them. And when trust leaves a university, the fundamental character changes and basically it can't really function. And then imagine that these students that began graduating in May of 2017, imagine that you run a small company, you have a tight-knit team, and you hire one of them. And this person is always looking to call someone out. So there's even a review of our book. Thank you for writing this book. Now I understand why all our bright new young hires go running to HR as soon as they overhear a joke in the hallway. I've heard from so many business people now, just in the last year. It's like, it's an unending soap opera. We're all so exhausted because somebody said something, somebody got angry, and this is taking up all our time. So when this call-out culture, which was nurtured in the university, in certain universities, especially in the Northeast and the West Coast, this call-out culture, industries that hire from those so journalism, media, and tech, talk to people in those fields about their young employees, and they'll say they're making life a nightmare. There's no trust anymore. Everybody's walking on eggshells. Yeah. That makes it very difficult to be creative. It makes it difficult to be cooperative.
No. I will say, John, I am broadly in sympathy with you, but the notion that everyone's life is a nightmare in tech.
Not everyone.
Yes.
But no, well.
Yeah. My experience, limited as it may be, with Silicon Valley is they're doing just fine. And if they have problem with people running to HR because it's usually because their bonus is, 6 figures as opposed to 7.
Mm-hmm. A year ago, that was true. Talk to people now. This is very new.
Yeah, and when it comes to tolerance for things like sexual diversity and sexual expression, that definitely polls well. But it's hard to kind of also at the same time say tolerance, because when you look at sort of the speech policing that comes from the most activist members of the community, it's just so easy to get in trouble for even what might be a faux pas in any other time in history. And so one of the interesting things is also in the data that shows kind of the polarization of our society is sometimes you can surprise people by saying, and actually did you know that in iGen, people born after Gen Z, people born after 1995, that they're actually more conservatives. And people are kind of surprised when you say that. And it's like, and they're more liberals. Just there's a lot fewer moderates. Polarized. So some of the polarization of our overall society is actually reflected in our students. And what I get worried about is sometimes the way the arguments actually happen on campus. In the way of actually trying to show that you're tolerant and open-minded, it becomes what I call a perfect rhetorical fortress, where essentially it's just ad hominem questions without ever getting to the substance of the actual argument. Now again, it could be a minority of students, but it can prevent you from getting to the rich the dynamic of the discussions you can have.
Would you feel differently if you were a gay person of color who grew up in the South in the 1950s and was looking at the world from that perspective?
What's actually kind of funny about that is I got approached by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and I'm a big comic book nerd, and somehow they sensed that about me. And I've been talking to someone who very much follows that description, and he's a gay man, he's Latino in his 40s, And suddenly he's finding that he's being reported to the bias response team because he's not saying everything exactly right. So I think it depends on which one you talk to, but I am hearing this from a lot of people who are, by every sort of privileged dimension, not someone you would consider sort of like the oppressor, coming to us saying, listen, like I'm suddenly the oppressor. I'm suddenly like the bad one because I don't say things exactly by this very regimented way that you're now supposed to at my comic book art school. So I actually think that from a number of them, you could actually, I mean, this was interesting for a friend of mine who went to Vanderbilt. She's a gay woman, and she had friends, obviously on campus, but she also was friends with a big part of the gay and trans population of Nashville. And this is a former intern of FIRE, and she said that she was told quite explicitly by the LGBT group at Vanderbilt not to bring the kids from Nashville, the townies, the gay and lesbian kids from town, partially because they were constantly offended by the way these other kids would talk. So there is something there's an elitist aspect to it that is actually quite exclusionary, that actually ends up being used against, in some cases, people you would assume would be the people it was designed to protect.
But I think we can go even further with this. I think we can acknowledge the idea behind your question, which is we're privileged middle-aged white men analyzing a generation that is, sorry, in the book. I mean, in the book, where we talk a lot about Lenore Skenazy.
That's right.
We're privileged.
Great book. It's a great book.
So, and of course, a lot of the activism on campus, originally it was especially about racial issues and then LGBT and gender issues, and now it's about everything, it seems. But I certainly agree with your point that people would look at this from different perspectives. But the book is organized around 3 psychological principles, 3 great truths that are as true for black as they are for white, gay, straight, I mean, they're true for all human beings. So the 3 great untruths that we think kids are being taught are, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, always trust your feelings, and look at life as a battle between good people and evil people. And if you're a human being, those are probably the 3 worst ideas we could possibly put in your head if we want you to flourish. And so, thank you. And so, one of the best lines in the book, one of the best things that gets retweeted and quoted a lot, is a quote we have from Van Jones. So, Democratic activist, speaks at the University of Chicago, where they had an issue. They had somebody from the Trump campaign speak, and some students protested. And so David Axelrod asks Van Jones, "What do you think about this? No platforming, safe space stuff?" And Van Jones, he's clearly been thinking about this, and he's got, it's amazing what he says. He basically, more or less, he says, I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. Put on some boots and learn how to deal with adversity. So he's saying, if you're gay, if you're black, whatever you are, you need to be strong in this world. And going down this road of, you're so delicate, you're such a victim, we're going to protect you, that's the worst thing you can do to those people.
But what if it's I'm sorry to keep coming back to this. I mean, these are all comments made in the spirit of affection for this argument.
Okay. We like critics.
This is just a little nub of it that troubles is too strong a word, that I can't get around.
It triggers you.
It triggers me. Let's go back to the example I gave earlier. I'm a young black man living in southern Georgia in 1950. Mm-hmm. What does my life look like? Well, my life is full of lots and lots and lots of both small slights and significant structural impediments. Both matter. Mm-hmm. I am demeaned, or it's even worse if I'm a woman. I am demeaned on a daily basis through language, through attitudes, through reinforcement of my inferior status, and through, more than that, through a general feeling by the white majority that I should be okay because I should just be able to buck it up and try hard, and I can make it in America if I stop whining about racial prejudice, right? That was the line that was fed to black Americans for how many hundreds of years in this country. There's a there is an awful moment I was reading this. No, I was listening to a podcast, not my own, and there was a quote from someone in the. What podcast is, doesn't matter, but it was a quote from a white guy in the South in the 1960s, who was saying, you know, we've had 3 years of this civil rights nonsense. All right, enough already. You know, let's just shut up about black people and let's get on with our lives. That is a kind of manifestation of this idea that if we just tough it out and stop whining, everyone's going to be fine. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that this notion that that small slights don't matter does not have a distinguished history. It was used. It was part and parcel of a way in which women, minorities, all kinds of people were for many years kept down, right? So what we're seeing now is evidence of an overcorrection on the other side. Why is that a bad thing?
Yeah. Well, if you're talking about places where the laws say you don't have equal rights and the norms say you're garbage and you've got to move out of our way, that's a terrible situation. And there are times and places when you have to have aggressive and well-organized protest to try to knock things down. Yale University in 2015, Middlebury College in 2017. We're talking about places that are trying as hard as they can. The ethos, the culture is explicitly anti-racist, progressive, welcoming, inclusive. So the strategies that were completely legitimate at a time when there were actually legal barriers, it's a completely different world from the one that we're talking about here on campus.
Yeah, and one of the things, a study that came out that actually so played into my own experience, I was immediately suspicious of it, was the Hidden Tribes study, which came out in the past just a couple months ago. And basically my experience with a lot of the more aggressive kind of speech policing was it wasn't a poor black person from Georgia, it was generally a wealthy white person who's going to a very elite college. And that had been most of my experience of campus censors. They were elite, they were people who came from wealthy backgrounds. And one of the things that was in the Hidden Tribes study was it was talking about like the people who are the most passionate about this really aggressive form of speech policing is about 8% of the population. It's the highest economic class of any of the groups, and it has the least amount of actual racial diversity of every group except for the farthest to the right 8% group. So in a lot of times, and I've watched this happen over and over again, where people are saying, but what about this completely other situation, some other place, and that's why I should be policing microaggressions, but it takes the form of this very kind of like almost Victorian kind of at Stanford, you know, that essentially I'm going to police speech in the name of these people that actually I don't really know very well, but I know that this is a great evil, so I can make up for it somehow by being extra strict about what you're allowed to say. So in a lot of cases, what I see in this is a lot of classism, but it's partially coming, the classism is partially coming from the speech policers.
Good. I want that concussion.
I'm going to say I'll make one last point, and then I will respectfully retreat back to my. But here's another thing that I can't get around. You're simultaneously making two claims, right? One is a claim that we are on and I'm exaggerating only slightly, we are on the brink of a highly significant social catastrophe. And then simultaneously, both you and Greg, not you,
Not me.
talk about how it's a minority. In your case, it's 5% who are ruling it for everyone, and then we just had the 8% from you.
Thanks.
You know, if in fact this movement is undermining the culture of high-tech firms in Silicon Valley, how could 5%? Like 5% is a very small number. When were the noisiest 5% of any generation ever fun to hang out with? I mean, by the way, and a lot of your complaints are rooted in the behavior of students at relatively elite universities. when did students at relatively elite universities ever conform to our expectations of how adults ought to behave?
Yep.
You know, all of us, it's just the dysfunction took different forms. In my school, it was a complete absence of connection to any meaningful social issues whatsoever. I could have used a lot of what's going on in Stanford now. I almost would have thought it was a more morally engaged experience as opposed to people just prepping for finance jobs. So I don't know. I mean, I'm struggling with why I should have anything more than a kind of academic interest in this trend.
Because the dynamics of a group, the dynamics of a culture, is not a majority vote. One of the big findings of the Hidden Tribe study, the study that was put out by a group in the UK, but it's a huge study of America, is that majorities of every single group, male, female, old, young, black, white, majorities of every group dislike political correctness, except for that group that is called the progressive activist group on the far left. Yeah. So almost the great majority of people dislike political correctness, but we don't take a vote and say, you know what, most of us don't like it, therefore it's not going to affect us. It's not like that. Rather, we are all responding especially to threats. So it's one thing if 5% are kind of annoying, and you know what, they might say something annoying to you. You can put up with that. But what if instead we arm everybody with a little blowgun and they can shoot darts into you, and it really hurts. Like it really goes into your skin, and an inch in, it really hurts. And so everybody's got one, and 5% of them are just going around blowing them at like anybody who looks askance at them. Mm-hmm. I think I'd change my behavior. I think we all have. That's basically what happened on campus. Most of our students are great, but the fact that there is a poster in every bathroom at NYU telling students how to report me if I say anything they don't like. I change my behavior. I don't say anything they might not like.
And I have 2 points about that. One is just that it's also, that lines up with the Hidden Tribes study, is that these tends to be people from fancy schools, and in my opinion, we actually privilege people from fancy schools probably a little bit too much. Maybe this will actually be the time when some people start realizing, wow, I'm actually having a lot of trouble with the people I'm hiring from Yale and Stanford. Maybe I should be hiring more from University of Indiana.
Hello?
Which actually,
how hard is this?
Which absolutely,
they're all a problem. Stop hiring.
Which I actually think would potentially be a great outcome. So they are disproportionately influential people, and I'm not sure. And I think we give too much praise to people from fancy schools. The other thing that we just really have to get back to, though, is the mental health aspect of it. Nobody benefits from the kind of numbers we're seeing in terms of anxiety, depression, particularly when it's avoidable, particularly when you have a situation in which people are more or less creating an environment that are causing people to believe that they are mentally fragile when they're actually anti-fragile. To talk themselves into depression and anxiety, that's the thing that scares me the most personally, that there's no upside to a huge increase in anxiety and depression in society. So that's one of the reasons why I think everybody should take this seriously.
And it's not the kids talking themselves into it per se. It's if you've been growing up and you've only been in the back of the SUV and you've been taken every place, and there's always an adult organizing your life and mediating all your disputes and telling you what to do. That creates anxiety because you don't really have the internal locus of control.
Right. Yeah. The world really is a scary place. If you don't have an internal locus of control, you're a victim of circumstance. That's what they tell you.
And you've been told that everything out there is scary, and that's why you have to be with an adult all the time.
And I don't want to leave with the idea that we have some kind of I really feel genuine compassion for a lot of these students, because I think about Julie Lythcott-Haynes, who wrote a wonderful book called How to Raise an Adult, and she was the dean of freshmen at Stanford, and what she was seeing was these absolutely brilliant students who weren't spoiled. They were built like heat-seeking missiles. They were perfectly refined, perfectly designed to get into the Princetons and the Harvards and all of these fancy schools that we disproportionately value. But unfortunately, they hadn't been taught how to do their own laundry, how to actually manage their lives. Yeah. And when you don't have a locus of control, that is a perfect formula for having anxious and depressed people. And there's something really heartbreaking about the kind of stories Julie tells about these incredibly accomplished people who feel powerless in their own lives, that I think it should be tragic and effective to anybody who cares about next generation.
I promise. I said I was done, but I have one other. I mean, I literally am done. When the last time I was at the Y was about a year ago, and it was to hear Ronan Farrow in conversation with and I'm blanking on her name, the actress. Yes, Rose McGowan, talking about Harvey Weinstein. And that was at that moment when we uncovered something catastrophic and heartbreaking about the culture of one of the central industries of our day, right? Hollywood. That here was a guy who was Weinstein, one of the most important figures, and he was a serial sexual abuser and had been protected by the culture for a generation, if not more. Now, I'm looking at the 3 bad ideas in this book, and there are 3 ideas here that you enumerate, that you just talked about, that are thought to be highly problematic. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Well, that's sort of what we said to the people who were victimized by Harvey Weinstein. We said to them, well, you should get over it. You're fine. In some cases, maybe you got something out of it. This is not the same as blah, blah, blah. Second thing, always trust your feelings. A bad idea. Well, that was also what we did in the case of those women who were victimized in those cases. We told them that their feelings didn't matter, that the hurt that they carried for, in many cases, years and years and years, that had an extraordinary impact on their lives, was something that was of no concern to the broader culture, and that Harvey Weinstein should continue to be able to make great movies because that's a secondary thing. 3, life is a battle between good people and evil people was a bad idea. Well, Harvey Weinstein is an evil person, by the way, and so are a lot of the other people who, Les Moonves is not a good person, right? And I could go down the list of people who use their power, we are now discovering, in ways that had a profound impact. So I understand that these ideas can be bad in certain contexts, but I'm not upset about the rise of these ideas in this moment, because I feel like there's still an awful lot of work that we have to do as a society to make society a equitable and, I hate to use it, safe place for everyone, not just white men from elite colleges, right?
I think we all agree about that. Yeah, I think we all agree.
Yeah, we don't disagree, and this is something where I agree with Steven Pinker.
I use that move all the time as well, by the way.
Well,
to agree with my.
Well, but that essentially kind of like a lot of the problems that we see are the results of good things taken too far. That essentially political correctness is, like you said, it's an overcorrection. But lumping together, frankly, the idea of someone getting in trouble and people demanding that they be fired for defending students' rights to wear offensive Halloween costumes is the same thing as what happened with Harvey Weinstein. These are really things of different orders. Now, hold on. And so basically, like, it is absolutely wonderful that we are coming out against these monsters, and they are indeed monsters. It's the same way I feel about the anti-bullying campaign. When the anti-bullying campaign started, people expected me to be like, oh, this is speech policing. And my response was, no, it's about damn time. We didn't need to be as cruel to each other when we were kids as when I was a kid. But every virtue taken to an excess turns to a vice. And I think that if you look at the kind of cases we talk about in the book, we're not talking about Harvey Weinstein cases. We're talking about professors making arguments in good faith in thoughtful papers and being treated like monsters for it. I want all the Harvey Weinsteins in the world to be exposed and a rapist to be arrested. But if you think the same thing applies to the Brett Weinsteins of the world, to the Rebecca Duvals, I think that's quite another story.
But is it? Agreed. No, I totally agree. But I wonder whether you're being naive. I wonder whether you're being naive. I wonder whether it's realistically, is it possible to have the 90% good without the 5% who take it too far?
Sure, if you have notions of rights and there are people who violate other people's rights and then we prosecute them, I think that's a good thing. Yeah. I mean, rape is not a microaggression. Sexual, what Harvey Weinstein was doing was illegal.
It was monstrous.
Yeah, but, well, I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but many of the things that are damaging aren't as cut and dried as that, though, right? I mean, there's a reason that we're talking about this there were cultures that were hostile to outsiders, and that hostility was expressed in subtle ways. And when people talk about microaggressions, they are, in a sense, rehearsing arguments that may have real validity and meaning later on in the real world. Is that not a...
So the idea of microaggressions is right on 2 points and wrong on at least 2. The idea of microaggressions was proposed by Chester Pierce, I think it was a sociologist in the 70s, and then popularized in a 2006 or 7 article by Daryl Wing Su. So if a microaggression is a small act of aggression, maybe one that you can kind of deny that you had any intent, that's fine. That's a useful concept to have. And the other reason why a microaggression is useful is that it's meant to apply, so if you're Asian or if your skin is dark, people often ask you, where are you from? And what they really want to know is, what's your ancestry, what's your heritage? And so there's no harm intended, no hostility, but that can become tiresome. And so it would be good to have a word for that. And it would be good, if we're trying to assemble the most diverse possible campuses, it would be good to teach incoming students from all over the world, you know what, don't keep asking people where they're from unless you literally mean, where were you born? But it's useful to have a concept for that. And we have a concept. It's a very necessary concept. It's the word faux pas. Well, it's so necessary we had to borrow it from French because we didn't have the word, but we needed it. Okay, so faux pas. And so if you're bringing people together and they're human beings, young human beings from diverse places, diverse social class, you can say, you know what, there's going to be a lot of misunderstandings. Let's try to work this out. Diversity is hard. Diversity is hard work. If we do it right, we get benefits. If we do it wrong, we don't trust each other, and we have endless litigation. And so let's teach you about some things that you probably shouldn't say. Let's teach you about the concept of a faux pas, and that would be one school. But then in another school, they have the same incoming class, same kinds of issues to deal with, but what they do instead is they say, it's not a faux pas, it's an act of aggression. The world's divided between good people and bad people, and you can tell by looking at them. If they're binary dimensions, male is powerful, which is bad, and every other gender is weak, which is good. White is powerful, bad. So you teach students, see all those people out there? Break them up into binary categories. One side is good, the other side is bad. So let's throw away hundreds of years of progress where we tried to get over labeling people and hating them because of the group. Let's bring that all back. Hate those people, and those people. Put it together. Now, go. Oh, and by the way, here's the number to call if anyone offends you. Report them. Which school would you rather go to, regardless of what your race, sex, or sexual orientation is? Which one would you rather go to?
You said earlier that that this has affected the way you teach.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What do you not teach now?
Oh, I wouldn't teach. So, for example, one example would be, so I teach a course on professional responsibility. I teach in the business school. And we've always had a unit on discrimination law. They're going out into the world. And these are MBA students mostly, entirely. And so they need to know what the law is on all kinds of discriminations. We cover that. That I can do. But I used to talk about what are the issues. Is it numerical representation? Is it hostile climate? What are all the issues? And I would ask the people in the class, what are the kinds of issues that you face in the workplace? And it was kind of hard to get them to talk, because even by 2012, when I started teaching this course, people were a little on edge about talking about these issues. But I felt like I could do that, and it was a good thing for us to do in the class. But I wouldn't do that now, and I don't do that anymore. So, for example, if we were to talk, as we say in the book, the issue, say, in tech or anywhere else, if women face obstacles because of their gender, that's terrible, that has to end. If they are demeaned, if they're not taken seriously, all those issues are about how you're treated. If any group doesn't have equal dignity, that's a serious problem. Unfortunately, we've gone in widely across the culture for a concept of underrepresentation. So if a group is underrepresented, we then are taught, we're supposed to say that's evidence of structural sexism or racism. And we're not supposed to look at the pipeline. Do not look at the pipeline. Just, if it's not 50-50 in the physics department, it's structural sexism. Now, I used to bring that argument up. I used to say, what counts? What are the problems? Which ones should we focus on, and which ones should we say, you know what? If there's no obstacle and people choose differently, that's okay. I wouldn't dare do that now, because that's a microaggression. That's a micro-invalidation. I would be invalidating someone who believed that there is structural sexism. So I don't touch that stuff.
There's a way for you to make that argument without... I'm puzzled by that. You strike me as being both extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily articulate.
Yeah.
You can't say that in a way that wouldn't get a...
Well, I can, and I just did. I just wouldn't do it at a school that I teach at.
Yeah.
Wait.
I mean, I can see first of all, I hear you that it's a shame you can't teach the way you want to teach, but I don't understand why that in
Because if there's one student,
you can't revisit.
If there's one student who objects, I'm really, really busy, and this could take up weeks of my time.
Yeah.
Plus, there could be articles written about me in the paper. I mean, it's just a nightmare. So it's just don't provoke.
And Malcolm, if I got add a point from the book, and something I've been developing a little bit more since we wrote the book, is I've been working on college campuses, and it was since 2001, and it's always been a problem if John says something that can piss off the PR department in class. That's been an issue for a long time. It's always been a problem that if John says something that that someone uncharitably determines as being even arguably like something that is discriminatory in class, he gets reported to the general counsel. And I see a lot of really frivolous cases of people being reported for actually, for example, discussing racial epithets, not actually using them, for multiple cases to that effect. That was already the case in 2013. Now you have to worry about who is the single least trustworthy student in your class, because sometimes these are made in good faith, sometimes they're not. And now we've added an extra level to it where what is this going to look like when it hits Twitter? And you have people on the left who will come after you, but now you've got the addition of Fox News and people actually forming right-wing mobs, getting people fired. And when we talk about in the book, we have a whole chapter on how this has actually gotten worse, and it's been one of the major trends of the last year. So right now, professors have every reason in the world to be pretty worried about what they're able to say in a classroom, and that's a pretty unhealthy situation.
That's right. There's a spectacular collapse of trust. The woman who runs Heterodox Academy, it's a group that I co-founded to encourage viewpoint diversity in universities. So Deb Mashik is here in the audience. And she talks about the last time she taught a course at Harvey Mudd College out in the Claremont colleges, and how there was a student who was clearly taping her. He was clearly videotaping the lecture. And it's not clear whether the person's on the right or the left. You might know if you know other things, but right, you don't know who. People can get you in trouble. Yep. And so it's just better to just, as Deb says, one of her students said to her, my motto is, silence is safer. That's a terrible motto for a college student. But this is what you hear, not everywhere in the country, but at the elite schools especially, walking on eggshells. And just in the last 3 months, I'm hearing people in business say that much more.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We have questions here in the audience, but I've been remiss. This is a good one, and this is, what?
No, we're fine. It's 8:05.
Oh,
or 8:08.
This is actually a wonderful segue. The question is, what trends do you foresee as this generation graduates and enters the workforce? And I wanted to, you've talked a little bit about that, John, and I'd like all of you actually to weigh in on this, because so I can see that as you first enter, let's concede that in fact there is a core of students with this malignant set of attitudes, and who are, I can see how when they first enter the workforce, they might bring these attitudes with them. But I think this question is about persistence.
Mm-hmm, right.
Are the disciplines of the workforce such that these kinds of things will get washed away? Can you continue to behave this way and still have a functioning career into your 30s?
Guess we'll see.
So because I teach in a business school and I study moral psychology and business ethics, so I've been talking with a lot of people in business. And I think the CEOs are now where the university presidents were in 2015. They don't know what hit them, and when there's a problem, they're reactive, and what they don't do is stand up for a principle. What they end up doing is validating the narrative, and that's a big mistake. So like at Yale, for example, when the protesters charged that Yale is structurally and systemically racist, and they had all kinds of charges against Yale, and they said that the Erica and Nicholas Christakis were terrible, and some called for them to be fired. A good leader would have said, I hear you, I can agree with you on this point and this point. However, these faculty members were acting in good faith, and I'm going to stand up for them. So that would be leadership, and that's what almost no university president has done. I can name 2 examples where they did that, and it works brilliantly. But if you validate the narrative that this place is terrible, life is divided between good people and evil people, we need more diversity training, and again, university doesn't do anything, but it's kabuki theater, but let's just do it again anyway. If you validate that narrative, you're stuck and you're just going to keep doing it. So in 2015, when our article came out, a lot of people said, oh, come on, when they go out into the real world, this will wash away. And we didn't know what happened. Now it's clear it's not washing away. If leaders give a good, if they can set norms, and obviously you have to attend to issues of inclusion, sexism, of course. So we're not saying just say, oh no, go to hell, suck it up. That's not going to work and that's not the right thing to do. But if you really are trying and you can show that you're trying, and then you can also stand up for norms, something like, we're all in this together. We have a good company. We think we make a good product for our customers. We have a lot of external competition. We have to all hang together. We're going to hang apart. Now, people have problems. We've got to work it out. We've got to give each other the benefit of the doubt. That's the key phrase, benefit of the doubt. And that's what has vanished from my world.
Lenore?
I actually had something to say. Yay.
Sorry, Lenore.
And this is just because I really wanted to tell this one story, and I think it actually is relevant, which is that I interviewed about 20 kids 2 months ago. They were in grammar school, about what they would do if they could have some independence, if they could do something on their own, what was their dream. And the story that stuck with me the most is I think it was a 4th grader said he wanted to get himself to judo. And I was like, okay, that's pretty good. You know, this is in the suburbs, it was out in Long Island. And I said, how? Like, you're gonna take a bike or a skateboard, you're gonna walk there? And he said, no, I'm gonna get out open the car door, and then I'm gonna look very carefully both ways, and then I'm gonna walk into judo while my mom parks the car in the parking lot. So for him, as a 9-year-old, this was the most independence he could even imagine, was, I don't know, 57 seconds without his mom with him going into yet another supervised, organized activity. And the reason I think it's relevant to your question about what's happening in the workplace is, before that I had been speaking to a friend who worked at a small nonprofit, not any of ours, and she said that there was one of the young women that she was working with had just said, I have to take a couple weeks off, I'm anxious, and just took 2 weeks off. And I feel bad for that person feeling that anxious, but I think I would feel very anxious if the sum total of my independence was, even at age 9 or 10 or 11, just always being supervised. And John, actually something that I've heard you talk about boy, have I heard you guys talk a lot lately. They're everywhere. Is that human beings are the one species that doesn't go straight from 0 to reproduce, die, which is good because it gives us a little more time. But what humans do is they start out growing really, really fast, and then around 6, 7, 8, 9, they slow down until puberty. And the theory, your theory, which I now have co-opted, is that why do we slow down? And it's because humans need to take in so much more than gazelles or whatever, worms. So that's when kids are playing and exploring and arguing and fighting and making things happen and copying adults and getting all this wiring in their brain. And if instead all they're doing is walking from the car to judo, and maybe they're really missing out on a fundamental part of their maturity, which has been taken from them under the guise of safety, and now they're left without it. You know, when kids learn a language, when like they're 6, 7, 8, 9, you throw them into another country, they learn the language and they don't have an accent. But after that, they do, because that was the time when they were really ready to soak everything up, and we're not letting them develop. And so that's the connection between us, is that if you're keeping kids indoors, constantly supervised, constantly in structured activities, and they don't develop those synapses, then they're kind of unformed, and they get to college, and they're anxious, and they're sensitive.
And I'm willing to go so far as to make some predictions and a stock tip.
Oh.
And I would say 2 things. What the actual scale of this and how business adapts to it. Business can be very adaptable, and I think that some of these schools that actually hire from University of Indiana are going to end up doing better than some of these companies that hire exclusively from Yale. But I do think, I'm willing to predict that there are going to be several, currently prominent nonprofits, cause-based organizations that are either completely fail due to some of these new cultural pressures, or rendered irrelevant in the next 5 years. I think you're going to see lots of stories about this changing in culture, because I'm hearing a lot about this. My stock tip is invest in human resources companies. The HR departments are going to get a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of litigation,
Go into employment law. That's what I tell
Yeah,
students.
employment law. Yeah.
I tell them walk to judo.
I mean, part of me wants to end on a stock tip, this being Manhattan. Have, information you can use. But wait, maybe we have time for one other little, I'm just going through these questions here.
You have to read and talk.
I am to remind you that John and Greg will be signing their books next door in the art gallery after we conclude. So do stick around and have your book signed. The signing process will be supervised by a whole team brought in by the Y.
And lawyers too.
Hold on to someone's hand.
Pick a buddy.
I feel like all these questions, were I to ask them, would simply, we would never get out of here. And everyone, the questions, it will be reassuring to all of you that these questions suggest that no one particularly was interested in what I had to say and was terribly interested in what you had to say. So, if we had to pick,
I was interested.
To me that
Yeah.
we've got a winner.
We'd have you back.
We'd have you back.
I suppose let me ask one last question, and that is: all of you have ideas about ways in which we can correct this cultural trend. How optimistic are you that we will be able to do that? We'll be able to bring some kind of course correction. Do you go to bed and get anxious over
always
over what
anxious.
is happening? Or
How ironic, right? I'm like the most nervous person on earth. So why did I start Let Grow? Why did we start Let Grow? Because we are optimistic, and we think that everybody's going to recognize that no one wants to raise fragile, hypersensitive, whiny, fall-aparters. And so once we get our ideas out there, which is what we're doing here, letgrow.org, there, Daniel Schuckman, our chairman, is here. He said, get the name out. There it is, letgrow.org. There are so many easy ways to give kids more independence and to get them playing again and solving their own problems. They're free. And so many parents are sick of helicoptering and worrying and driving and spending all their days at parties where they're eating cold pizza because somehow they can't drop their kids off and they're 20 at a party. So maybe at 20 you shouldn't. But the point is that I'm very optimistic because I think we have some really easy ways to course correct, and I think the culture is ready for them.
I mean, my number one motivating concern is freedom of speech. And I wrote a book called Freedom from Speech in 2014, in which I argue that what we call problems of progress in the book, that as things get better, there are certain things that tend to get worse. And my belief is that as a lot of positive changes that I want to see happen, there's a negative side of it in which people get less and less capable, willing, or able to deal with people they disagree with, to deal with people who they genuinely differ with. So I think that there's almost like a historical force pulling against freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is extremely rare in human history, but it's this incredible invention, and particularly when you include things like the scientific method and John Roush's liberal science, we have so much to thank for it. But I am pessimistic in the sense that it's gonna be an uphill battle. And that's one of the reasons why, at FIRE, we're working on everything from, video pieces. I'm writing a graphic novel to try to get to kids much, much earlier. We already have one that's coming out. We're trying to get these ideas to students earlier and spin it in a new way that's a little bit humbler. That basically freedom of speech is just knowing the world as it actually is. And that means that you're not safer from a bigot if you don't know he's a bigot. You're not safer from evil if you don't know where it is. And that essentially, as Harvey Silverglate puts it, I want to know who the Nazi in the room is so I know not to turn my back to him. And I think that if we think of the world a little bit more in terms of the way maybe a scientist would see it, an anthropologist would see it, we start getting what the real value of freedom of speech is. It's to tell you the uncomfortable truths about the reality around you, not to pretend that we're better off just not discussing it at the dinner table.
Yeah. John, the last. The last word.
Yeah. So when I look at current trends and I sort of graph them out as though they were going to continue, yeah, I get very pessimistic because if this continues, then trust will drain out of business and every other institution, and then we'll completely collapse. But whenever I think that way, but whenever I go down that mental road, there's a little Steve Pinker in the back of my head saying,
Literally.
Steve Pinker's last 2 books, talking about how people have always thought the world's going to hell, and in fact, things are getting better fast. And globally, and Nick Kristof has been talking about this beautifully too, globally, things are getting better fast. Poverty is declining, racism is declining, all these things are good. And one of the main things I've learned from reading Steve's work and also Matt Ridley is that when there are problems, the amazing thing about human beings is we're actually really inventive and creative, and we figure out what's the problem, and then we figure out ways to solve it. And so I think 2 or 3 years ago, I think most parents didn't know just how serious the mental health issue was for teenagers, especially for teenage girls. But I think this is the year, just because the data really only just came in a year or 2 ago. It was happening 2 or 3 years before, but we didn't have data on it until a year or 2 ago. So I think this is the year when it's going to turn around, when we're all going to put our heads to this. We're all going to recognize this is not political. This is not like, conservative kids are depressed and liberals aren't advice. It's nothing to do with that. This is the health of our kids. So I think that, so things happen like we start Let Grow. And there's going to be all kinds of innovation. We're in a situation, it's sort of like the emperor's new clothes, where most people don't like political correctness. Most university presidents don't like what's happening, but they're afraid. It's like, there's so many people who see that there's a problem, and if we can now just, we talk about a lot of possible solutions in the book, I think this is the year when people are going to gingerly start trying them and discover that they actually don't get shot for it, that actually a lot of people applaud, and that's going to encourage them. Universities that grab onto this and figure out how to create an environment in which people can actually speak up in class, and you know that if you go into a seminar class at this school, people might disagree with you, they're not afraid to. Those schools are going to attract more applicants, and that's going to make their US News numbers go up, and once some, like Chicago, when the University of Chicago, as their numbers are going up, other schools are going to copy them. So even though I'm often pessimistic, you just think about what happens when humans face problems. We usually figure out how to solve them, and I think this one will be like that.
Good. Well, let's hope that movement starts tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. One last reminder, book signing in the back. Be safe out there.